Okay, we might start now. It's my pleasure this evening to introduce Jennifer Jones, who's going to be speaking to you and about some remarkable women. I'm going to take some credit for the paper before it's even given, because I have the honour of having introduced Jennifer to the Brown correspondence, and I'm not sure if she's ever forgiven me for that. She might show you a picture of the handwriting.
Yeah, he's ruined my eyesight.
So I'll hand it over to you, Jennifer.
I'm a fair bit shorter than Charles. The Central Victorian Gold Rush represented a second wave of dispossession and tragedy for First Nations people in this land. The population of the new colony grew from 77,000 in 1851 to around 400,000 by 1857. 90,000 people arrived in Melbourne during 1852 alone. Jarrah land was amongst the most heavily impacted by the physical assault of gold mining. The viability of traditional lifestyles was dramatically reduced as the surrounding lands were expropriated and exploited to feed, house and maintain the new settlers on the goldfields. But Jarrah people were resourceful. Many clans had retreated to their northern country on the Loddon Plains, where they took roles as stock riders, shepherds, stock keepers, hut keepers and domestic servants. Some resourceful people outsourced their labour, doing sheep washing, bark stripping, wood chopping and water carrying. These roles sustained a relatively stable connection to country, which is the foundation of spiritual well-being. I acknowledge the traditional owners of this sacred land, the Jarrah people, and pay respect to their elders past, present and emerging. And I pay tribute to their tenacity, their survival of historic upheavals of this double dispossession. First squatters, then miners, before their forced removal to Corranderk Station in 1870. And yet their relationships to spiritual landscapes persist today, and their culture is now resurgent because their history, their songs and their stories of spirit lore are embodied and encoded in the land. And elders have nurtured this spiritual connection to this country across the generations. So Charles gave you a little bit of context with how I first came to meet the Browns. It was through a major project which is completed now called Faith on the Goldfields. This was an Australian Research Council funded project, and our major output is a manuscript that's with publishers at the moment, hopefully getting the thumbs up. It's been through a few hurdles, and that book is called Faith, Spirituality and Social Cohesion on Victoria's Goldfields since 1851, Living Together on Bendigo's Upside Down Country. And it's written with my co-chief investigators, Tim Jones, Nadia Rook and Charles Fay, and also with Natasha Joyce and Elizabeth Offer. So this book is about the struggle to navigate religious difference and social cohesion that's been a constant but neglected theme in Australian history. The book tells the story of how residents in one dynamic region of Australia, i.e. the Goldfields, have largely successfully lived together in religious and cultural diversity. The Central Victorian Goldfields is an iconic site in Australia's history of settler arrival seeking gold, of rapid expansion, mining, deindustrialisation and new waves of migration. It's also been a crucible for the negotiation and celebration of religious and cultural diversity. So using social and material approaches to history, our book charts the way that faith influenced people's lives and communities and the histories of these communities. This book was written because our industry partners, the Aspire Foundation, which is the cultural and charitable auspice of the Catholic Diocese of Sandhurst, and also this City of Greater Bendigo, wanted the project to go ahead, and they sought our collaboration and helped us to see the project through to the end. I wrote a number of chapters for that book. In one chapter, chapter 2, I looked at the sacred landscapes of the Jara people, examining how settler land management and labour transformed the land and forced the removal of its people, but couldn't extinguish their loving links to the land and to each other. In chapter 5, I deal with the Browns, who are the topic for this talk today, looking at Providence and how women adjusted to the pressures of living in quite a rudimentary goldfields area, how their daily life was shaped by their religious practice in quite alien conditions. And that chapter focuses on breastfeeding and managing as a young mother with a young family during the drought that devastated this area and led to the death of a lot of infants during the early gold rush period. In chapter 7, I wrote a chapter with Dr Brian Rule, about how Bendigo failed to become a Protestant city, in that militant Protestant sectarianism couldn't survive the efforts of local people to in fact practice religious pluralism. So it looked at how industrial diseases and decline in the mining sector dampened community enthusiasm for Irish sectarianism. So really looking at how people held together when there were efforts to draw them apart because there were other things that were more pressing. This book has a couple of unusual approaches, one being that we have small chapters called pop-outs that sort of pop out of the larger chapters, offering really concise vignettes that allowed us to look at more case studies. One of these was about completing the Sacred Heart Cathedral, written with Rachel Goldust, who is here tonight, looking at the construction of the cathedral, which went from 1896 right through to 1977, and exploring the craft and experience of workers who completed the cathedral. And this is through the life story of carpenter Paul Coppock. One of the other short chapters that I wrote was called Transforming Old Sandhurst Town into the Great Stupa of Universal Compassion, and it looks at how local connections to a recreated mining village created the environment for the reception of a sacred Buddhist monument. So quite a transformation of this area, which rises 48 metres above Bendigo's distinctive bushland. So there's small chapters offer us opportunity to show, to have a look at more topics than we would have in a standard book. Now, the reason I'm introducing you to our new book, aside from being the ad, is to tell you how I came to know the Brown family, who I'm talking about tonight. So chapter 5 in that co-authored book drew upon the life experiences of a Scottish family whose chain migration started in 1852 with James Hoey and his widower brother-in-law, Andrew Hamilton. Now, I'll see if I can get the pointer to work in this.
Green button.
Yep. So James Hoey is the rather ill-looking man here. In fact, he died not very long after that photo was taken. And Andrew Hamilton was his brother-in-law, but he was a widower when he migrated to Australia with Tom Hoey, who's not pictured here, his younger brother, and also the Hoey's sister, who is married to Mr. Bucky, but I've forgotten his first name just now. Mr. Bucky probably is all that I knew him as in the letters. So it was a family migration, first to Ballarat and then later to Bendigo in the search of gold. Contemporary commentators thought that the goldfields environment, with its feverish pursuit of gold and unhealthy focus on money-making, would distract diggers from their religious obligations. Then and now, attention to mining work and public activities has been the focus of much historical research, with many characters taking up the attention of historians. Characters like mine owners, theatrical entrepreneurs, hotel keepers, prostitutes, drunken diggers and criminals, you could say, have perhaps overshadowed the quieter lives of goldfield residents like the Brown family. Recalling the early gold rush, William Stammer said he could hardly believe his eyes as he stood at the door of his hotel and watched the good people going to church, the women decked out in silks and satins, and the men wearing tweed and broadcloth. And instead of the rough, unkempt, dirt-stained community I had expected to find, I beheld a staid, church-going population. No mistake about it, had not S taken me behind the scenes and piloted me to a vagabond quarter where his digger friends were domiciled, I should most probably have left Sandhurst with the impression that it was the sort of place where those 90 of the 9 just persons might have lived who needed no repentance. So Sandhurst certainly made an impression of righteousness in the early gold rush period. And this is despite the fact that unfavourable colonial conditions, including makeshift infrastructure and non-preferred denominational practice, made regular religious observance difficult and somewhat distasteful for the Christian faithful. The family I'm studying, which included James Hoey's new wife Maggie Brown and later her sister Jane, who married Andrew Hamilton, so I've got the couples lined up there, they were devout United Presbyterians. The patriarch Robert Brown, deceased, and his son James Brown, who's pictured here, were both United Presbyterian ministers in Scotland. Dissenting Scottish Presbyterians, even when they lived in gold mining towns, still valued the strict Sabbatarian discipline of their Cedar heritage, but colonial conditions made it difficult to replicate, so compromises had to be made, and today we'll have a look at some of those. Well, this is an example of quite an easy letter to read, actually. You only have to turn it around several times, and they're much easier to read in person. I had the opportunity to go to Scotland to read the originals, and they are actually a lot easier to read than the microfilm. But now this collection is online, and the quality is quite good. So it's not impossible, but it does take a fair bit of persevering. And I did value having Charles on the team because, being of an older generation, he was more familiar with cursive handwriting. I think younger historians will really struggle with cursive script because of unfamiliarity. So 15% of gold rush migrants were Scots, and Presbyterians constituted 85% of these, but just 16% of this number were United Presbyterians like the Browns. So they were from a small subset of Presbyterians in Scotland. This denomination were liberalising Calvinists who championed a religious culture focused on individualism, respectability and economic opportunity. They were educated, lower middle class, urbanising lowlanders. The Browns were therefore in good position to describe their experience on the goldfields, and they did that by exchanging letters between Sandhurst and Glasgow from 1852 to 1870. These letters provided a channel of solidarity and consolation in circumstances where the imperial imaginary, or what people expected, was abundance, but in fact their lived experience was scarcity and want. The collection, in fact, holds more than 3,375 letters that were written between 1810 and 1899, but I'm just looking at a subset of those. The eloquence and regularity of the Brown family correspondence offers unparalleled insights into the domestic, spiritual and financial lives of this migrant family on the goldfields. Letters enabled negotiation and management of their failed expectations, especially as they related to normative gendered Christian behaviour. Soon after her arrival in Melbourne, Maggie Hoey observed with dismay that the Sabbath is not kept as it is at home. And later, in the absence of a Presbyterian congregation of her persuasion in Bendigo, The family maintained disgruntled attendance at the Methodist chapel, and you can see from the quote here, "These Methodist local preachers often make a fool of the thing altogether. I believe it would be far better for me reading a good book, but still it gives our little boy an idea of the difference of the Sabbath from the other days of the week." So perhaps going wasn't too far a trial, though she didn't manage to get her enthusiasm up to go if it was raining or hot. So it was a moderate effort available to go and hear the Methodist preacher. Reading a good book was more reliable because it gave access to correct theology and opinions, unlike the poor offerings that she received from non-preferred locations. These readings offered solace to educated but impoverished women like Maggie Hoey, living in a harsh climate, in a crude home, and with very basic religious infrastructure. While Hoey's work on the diggings, her husband, kept the wolf from the door, Maggie had to practice economy as much as she had to do at home, living with her mother, who was a widow of a Presbyterian minister. So they were in quite reduced circumstances. So borrowing books was probably a more realistic avenue of access to literature for Maggie, though we do know that her family sent her letters and transcripts of sermons and other things to read, newspaper clippings, etc. So reading a good book in Sandhurst. Access to education in Scotland had been encouraged since the Protestant Reformation, and schools were established in most lowland parishes where this family were from by the late 17th century. And in fact, even in England, many working class people could read by the early 19th century thanks to the spread of evangelical Sunday schools. Growth in wealth and leisure stimulated demand for reading materials, which included histories, travel accounts, biographies, novels, current affairs, materials, pamphlets and tracts. In fact, the most influential books of the period were the Bible, Pilgrim's Progress and Paradise Lost, both of which had biblical themes. A religious milieu was almost overwhelming in this society at the time. But not everyone read for moral edification. Literature aimed at the lower orders included a thriving industry in sensational, scurrilous and pornographic writing. So to counter this, churches and religious groups like the Religious Tract Society and the British and Foreign Bible Society poured out torrents of religious and moralising literature, seeking an audience, trying to convert people from those other forms of reading. Upper working and lower middle class readers like the Browns owned books, which they circulated amongst their friends and family. Popular literature, newspapers and letters were often read aloud. The Browns make mention of reading sermons and poetry, which was sent to them or lent to them. The numbers who peruse literature from libraries, book clubs or societies is reasonably unknowable aside from memberships. I don't know if Maggie Brown or her sister Jane borrowed literature from the Sandhurst Mechanics Institute or the Free Library, but the collection does indicate the cultural milieu in which they lived and what the people of Bendigo were interested in or the tenor of their thoughts. So I'm hoping to write a good book about the Browns rather than reading one, hopefully, and this effort has been supported by the Sandhurst Research Grant Fund, which was awarded to support the creation, publication, dissemination and discussion of historical literature related to the Sandhurst Collection. It's offered through the Bendigo Tertiary Education Anniversary Foundation and the Hayward Library of La Trobe University, Bendigo, and that grant has supported this research. So what I'm hoping to do is to write a book called Providence and Misfortune in the Land of Gold. It's a monograph that aims to examine the loss and suffering of the Brown family on the Bendigo goldfields from 1852 to 1870. Most gold seekers and their families migrated with the view of attaining great advantage from the diggings, but many encountered significant misery instead, as many of you in the audience well know. Population upheaval, environmental catastrophe, rough living conditions, poverty, illness, early death, these sorts of things tested the fortitude and endurance of many individuals and families. And this project considers how religious belief, including submission to the mysteries of Providence, rendered frontier life comprehensible. Divine transcendence made God responsible for everything that happened in the world in a providential worldview, and this included human economies. Such views affirmed that life was sufferable, even misfortune, and that could happen even in the land of gold. So in this project, I've taken a socio-cultural history approach, and it values the role played by popular culture in the process of economic and political change. So what I'm doing is, much like the previous book, I've got chapters that focus on characters in the Brown family and pop-outs that are drawn from the contemporary literature of the Sandhurst Collection to give an idea of what people were reading and thinking in this period. The reading tastes at the Sandhurst Mechanics Institute will be utilised to expand understanding of the larger historical processes and structures that were happening in the area. Hopefully shedding new light on the ideas that underpinned speculative capitalism and its expression in Bendigo's boom and rush. Gold diggers like the Browns brought with them a culture that highly valued voluntary structures, including social innovations like mechanics institutes and savings banks, which were transported from Scottish towns and cities across the globe, transforming the globe. Analysis of popular and Scottish-specific literature held by the collection, including contemporary literature, poetry, advertisements, hymns and sermons, will provide evidence of the impact of popular culture on the everyday beliefs of diggers like the Scottish family, hence accounting for wider social worlds. So this is an example from chapter 2, which is yet to be written. But we'll give you an idea of the approach that I'm starting to take. So chapter 2 looks at Maggie Hoey's experience. Maggie Hoey was a young mum when she moved to Bendigo with her husband, and she was very pleased with how neat, tidy and cosy their tent was. But she faced environmental hazards unique to the goldfields that intensified her and her family's awareness of the transience of life. Risks included those of the period, childbirth and child rearing, but these were particularly highlighted in Bendigo because of the absence of a supportive network of kin. Ideals of progress and improving the chance of children to survive infancy and childhood in Britain had influenced the changed conception of childhood as a distinct, unspoiled and innocent phase of life. The meanings that the Hoeys ascribed to childhood as educated lower middle class parents therefore jarred somewhat with their experience on the goldfields. Children here, as Natasha Joyce is proving in her PhD, were heightened. The risk that they face from accidents, especially falling down mine shafts and from drowning, as well as environmental hazards. Then you've got the additional everyday risks of infancy, including illness. So these are things that the Hoeys were really aware of. Maggie Hoey was mother of 2 infants, Robert, who was born in 1855, and Maggie in 1857, when they first moved to Bendigo. And they're out looking for firewood in July 1858 when Robert was crushed by a tree branch. Now, the worry for the boy's life was such, it was hanging by a thread, as she describes in her letters. It undermined the delicate health of Maggie Hoey, who was heavily pregnant at the time the accident happened. This grave situation improved, however, as Robert recovered and Maggie gave birth to an apparently sturdy child, Henry. But Jane, her sister, continued to worry. And she writes to her mother, "Poor Maggie, I often picture her out in her weak health, surrounded by her 3 little helpless ones. How tender and gentle the members of a family should be to each other while they are yet together, for the time soon comes when they have no more the opportunity. So that's going to be the focus of the chapter, but popping out of that is a household guide called Lady Bountiful's Legacy to Her Friends and Family, a book of practical instructions and duties, counsels and experiences, anecdotes, hints and recipes in housekeeping and domestic management, calculated to increase comforts of home, by John Timms. Published a little bit later than Maggie's experience, but 1868, but drawn from the society that understood that this was the way to manage a home, so generally contemporaneous. Interestingly, Lady Bountiful was a character drawn out of George Farquhar's Restoration comedy, The Beaux' Stratagem from 1707. In this play, Lady Bountiful is, or it's her persona that helps her become a byword in the society for a middle to upper class female who's generous and open-handed. In fact, she becomes a philanthropic archetype, an agent of social improvement. Lady Bountiful's visits and ministrations grew upon the cultural philosophy of domesticity and reflected a desire for order, stability and morality. Later she becomes a cliche that's ridiculed and caricatured by Dickens and Punch for her or their insensitivities and limited class attitudes. But Lady Bountiful's legacy offered a practical guide modelled on herbal medicines and folk remedies used by knowledgeable women. She offers solutions to daily problems that made women's lives anxious and difficult, and is therefore quite helpful if you're isolated from your family and the women in your family that would have offered that assistance. They didn't have the benefit of texting back then. The letters took quite a while to arrive, and in fact they were often keeping things from their family members in the letters until they knew that particular situation was safe or resolved in a positive or negative way. So this chapter and pop-out combination draws attention to the effects of poverty on Maggie Hoey and her children in isolation from these traditional supports where this sort of guide might have come in use. So that gives you an idea of what I'm going to do in the book. But now let's turn to Andrew Hamilton for a little look at how religion shaped his daily life. And a little bit of a warning, later in this section there's a little bit of a blue tinge. Now, Andrew Hamilton was born at Crofthead, which is possibly a tenant farm, near Old Cumnock in Ayrshire in Scotland in 1815. He married Janet Hoey, older sister of the Hoey brothers who he came to Bendigo with, in 1838 when he was 23 years old. Family sources relate the tragedy of his early family life as Janet Hoey, her 2-year-old daughter baby Janet, and a new baby all died in August 1841. I haven't quite dug up that tragedy yet, but I do know that the baby and Janet, his wife, predeceased little Janet. And in fact, on 13 August 1841, Hamilton wrote, "Little Janet is dead and has so escaped a world of sorrow, trial and bereavement, and I trust has gone to a better place. Thus are ended natural ties of sympathy and affection which are certainly painful to break asunder, and there are hopes which a parent is able to cherish, and particularly in the circumstance in which I am placed, which cannot be swept away without leaving pain. But when thus the Lord speaks, we better not murmur, but rather humble ourselves before him under an impression that whatever he does, he doeth for his own glory and our spiritual good. Let us therefore try to profit by every act of providence towards us, seen particularly by these afflictive dispensations which from time to time are come upon us. May we be enabled to see the hand and hear the voice of him who is the author of them, leading and directing us, so that knowing his will, we may in some measure comprehend his purpose." Anne Toe argues that bereaved Victorian men were expected to keep their feelings of loss to themselves, that they were socially conditioned to believe that strong men controlled their emotions, and in fact they were expected to return to work soon after bereavement, and they weren't expected to practice prolonged mourning as evidenced through clothing, unlike women who were expected to wear widow's weeds or the external evidence of mourning for sometimes years. Men, however, were expected to return to daily life very quickly. If they did wear widower's weeds, this clothing was expected to be subtle. Social pressure was also there for them to quickly remarry if they had children. Andrew Hamilton, however, was still single 10 years after Janet died when he emigrated to Australia in 1852 when he was aged 37. He was 44 years old when he met Jane Brown, who was then 32, off the ship in September 1859. He met her at the docks and took her to her hotel because she had rushed to Australia as quickly as you could rush in those days because her sister Maggie was sick and as it turned out, dying. So she arrived in September 1859 and her sister died in mid-November that year. The family narrative describes the unexpected love between Andrew Hamilton and Jane Brown as being fostered while Jane was nursing Maggie. And in fact, the narrative goes, Jane falls in love with Andrew Hamilton one moonlit night on the veranda at Luga Villa near Brighton. They get engaged, but she has to go back to Eaglehawk with Maggie's 2 children. So immediately we have a frustrated love affair. Andrew Hamilton and Jane Brown interpreted their meeting as an act of providence. They both saw God's guiding hand. In December 1859, Hamilton confessed to Jane, I can hardly trust myself sometimes in the thought that so much treasure is mine. For years I'd almost abandoned hope of again being the object of so confiding and tender, loving woman's heart, and the reality now fills me with emotion. The status and remarriage experiences of widows is well researched, but much less is known about the remarriage and courtship experiences of widowers. Scholars have identified key questions about widowers' perspectives that need to be researched, including what assumptions informed a new courtship for a widower? How were these related to wider constructs of masculinity or obligations to establish friends and relatives? What rhetoric was used by the widower? And how did the woman react? What powers might she have had in a remarriage? And how did this history of the widower feed into the character and intensity of the courtship? And this is my focus for the next few minutes. How did this history of Andrew Hamilton's previous marriage feed into this new courtship and marriage? Christian men like Hamilton were expected to restrain their sexual appetites, their sensual and carnal desires, their behaviours, including food and sex, substances like alcohol and tobacco, activities like gambling and consumption, and a raft of other behaviours that were deemed to distract men from productivity, such as idleness, and also to distract them from their religious obligations. Religion was a motivating force in self-mastery, especially for the middle classes, and Andrew Hamilton uses the images of religious excitement and personal passion when he discusses his newfound love for Jane. He shows no sign of bodily disgust in the private correspondence, as we'll see. Jane Brown, by contrast, was subject to more stringent customary observations of grief, and this was her first engagement. So she was under pressure to observe proper mourning, which dictated the amount of time since the deceased passed, and this depended really on the family's social standing, the mourner's age, and the mourner's relationship to the deceased, and most stringently, the mourner's gender. Now, for Jane Brown, she was expected to progress through stages of mourning from deep through to half mourning for about 6 months after the death of a sibling. And lower classes did attempt to adhere to the mourning practices of the upper classes as much as was possible, and certainly to keep their respectability intact while they observed mourning. So Jane was in a bit of a tricky position, observing mourning and being engaged almost simultaneously. So her sister died in September. She's secretly engaged by October, and the couple are separated almost straight away because she returns to Bendigo with her brother-in-law to look after the children. However, on the 12th of January 1860, Jane Brown revealed her engagement to her mother, describing herself in this letter as unkind to you and selfish, and having many conflicting thoughts. This is before she gets to the good news. Guess what? I'm engaged. She says, in fact, a strange overruling providence distinctly pointed the way for me to take. So God's guidance, in fact, explains that it's okay to fall in love at the same time that you're in mourning for your sister. She says, now I have been frank with you and cannot help telling you this mail. Andrew thought it might be too trying for you, going from sad tidings which the last mail bore you, but I felt I must tell you. I feel that God has been and has abundantly rewarded me for the sacrifice I made in coming here. Through the first days of my engagement, the bonds of love in my mind, and she quotes a psalm, he hath led me forth by a higher way, so that he might bring me to a city of habitation. And then she says, excuse this egotistical letter. She's really quite divided about her situation. Andrew Hamilton wanted Jane to announce her engagement despite the expectations of mourning etiquette. He argued on the 14th of January 1860, I do not wish to think evil of James, but he has been so thoughtless to my view already. And you know the world is quick-sighted and no means charitable. I've been thinking, dear Jane, that it would be well, rather than otherwise, that the public of Bendigo should know our ties, and that you are only there on a brief visit to Eagle Hawk. So, public of Bendigo, you know that they're engaged, like she's actually a respectable woman. Jane's reply isn't in the collection, but it seems that Andrew needed to reassure her of his respect and value for obligations because, as you can see from the reply here, it's a bit of a sorry if I've offended you letter, which is quite usual in courting correspondence where there's often misunderstandings. I could not ask you to sin against your conviction. I shall not do anything to tempt you to violate a sacred vow of yours. In the present instance, I quite agree with you that exercising a little self-denial, it may be, our marriage joy shall be all the fresher and more enduring. I assure you, and I cannot count it a sacrifice, what I've said before, I can honestly now repeat that my feelings and desires towards you have never been of an impure character. I feel we are bound together to each other by higher and holier ties, and my anticipation of joy and happiness from our complete union are based on loftier emotions. I will get the hang of that clicker. Both Andrew and Jane were negotiating Jane Brown's deathbed commitment to her sister and the requirement of mourning etiquette. These elements introduced uncertainties and misunderstandings, as I said, which were common in epistolary courtships, while established family connections and responsibilities introduced stress into a remarriage situation. The couple were conscious of Andrew's prior marriage, that it might also impinge on their relationship and introduce an element of fragility, perhaps, that wasn't evident in first marriage courtships. Hamilton's open, even dramatic about his need for Jane. In a way, he's leveraging her to return to Brighton sooner than she might have planned and to marry as soon as possible. I cannot tell you, my dearest Jane, what my feelings have been since you left. I only know that when I returned to the house that morning, that the full import of your departure came upon me. Oh, that silence! That silence was almost intolerable. The very atmosphere seemed to have hardened and darkened so that I actually thought I could not breathe, and the stillness was less than that of the tomb. So I think he's being a little bit dramatic. Well, just slightly. He really wants her to be his wife very quickly, please. He says, "Dearest, now I feel that we have been separated, especially suddenly. It would be the most severe trial of my life, such a sad as such an event was to me in earlier life. I fear I could not sustain a similar lot with such fortitude. But, dearest love, I earnestly hope and pray that we may be long spared to each other." And this is a refrain in these letters between couples, that they will be spared to each other and to their family for their benefit. Prior history in terms of remarriage presents an interesting backdrop to courtship. And in this correspondence, there's a couple of Andrew Hamilton and his brother-in-law James Hoey are both widowers remarrying around about the same time. And Andrew Hamilton, of course, has a longer financial history than his brother-in-law, who's a younger man. He owns a villa already and has a successful business. So Jane has expectations of comfort to support her decision to accept his proposal. She says to her mother, "Before me, my dear mother, if God be pleased to spare us, the prospect of a life of ease, affluence and happiness for my dear Andrew seems to bear me a very deep and tender attachment." So for this couple, the prior union also introduces a spiritual or theological dimension, which is quite interesting to contemporary eyes. And the problem was for them a biblical understanding of who it was appropriate to marry through what's called the table of kindred or affinity or prohibited degrees, so who you could or couldn't marry. It's okay to marry your cousin, but it wasn't okay to marry your deceased wife's sister. And the problem of marrying a deceased wife's sister was negotiated for a couple of centuries before it was finally overturned in law. In fact, the prohibited degrees were drawn up in 1563 and formally adopted by the Scottish Church in 1603, and then remained current right through into the middle of the 19th century. In the UK, the movement to legalise sister-in-law unions was hotly debated and reflected a tussle between the established church and the state for authority over marriage. Its cultural context, however, was a literal interpretation of Genesis 2, that husband and wife became one flesh, and that therefore marriage meant a physiological as well as a spiritual and legal union. If one flesh with his wife, a man was related to, by blood, with his wife relations. Therefore, to marry his wife's sister was semi-incestuous in their worldview. A little bit outside of what we would think these days, but nevertheless it got people very hot under the collar. Particularly in an emotional climate where the middle and upper class families were intensifying their social isolation in terms of no longer being in large family groups, and brother and sister attachments were perhaps less hierarchical than attachments to parents, so they became quite intense. And the relationship between a man and his deceased wife's sister were therefore a focus of controversy, made especially sensitive because of these patterns of relating in families, and also because it was very common for unmarried or redundant women to live with a married sister and to take care of the children if the mother died, which is in fact what was happening to Jane. In the colonies, there was more competition between religious denominations and therefore more tolerance of varied opinions about whether it was okay. But I think Andrew Hamilton's letters come out on the side of not okay, and that the community needs to know that, in fact, you're not available to become James Hoey's wife because I've gotten you first. And in fact, during their correspondence, he notes, with the tenderness of Jane's reflection, on his prior marriage. You say you love her whom you never knew and bid me to cherish the memory of her, not being afraid that it will make you less dear to me. You are right, dear love, it cannot, but rather otherwise. You are right also in your conjecture I take it my thoughts of you and her sometimes do blend and mingle, and fancy has pictured me such a meeting as you refer to when we three shall be one. The influence, dearest, of such thoughts is not to be dreaded, and it is both devoting and purifying in its tenderness. So not at all unusual, apparently, this thought. Okay. Okay, so this is the blue part. The correspondence did get a little bit saucy, sticking with the cooking theme. And the love letters, this one in particular, used strong religious imagery, and the dirty minds in the room are now already laughing. Strong religious imagery to shape communication of desire. Andrew Hamilton writes to Jane in May. They get married in June, so it's getting close. Dearest love, I feel now that were we to be separated, especially suddenly, it would be the most severe trial of my life. Such a sad event was to me in earlier life. I could not sustain a similar now with such fortitude. But dearest love, I earnestly hope and pray that we may be long spared to each other until, having finished the work our Heavenly Father may give to us, together we may go down like a shuck of corn fully ripe in the juices of the divine spirit and full of faith and good work. My own love, Jane, when I think how the time will be here when we shall be in good providence of God, be together here in this very room 4 weeks, I am filled with an unspeakable joy which swells my heart within me. God grant that nothing may intervene to prevent the realisation of our hopes. And the good news is that nothing did. They got married. And in fact, interestingly, when they came to have their own daughter, this history of the widower really did show that it was pertinent to their lives. Andrew and Jane Hamilton called their first daughter Jessie after Jane's late sister, but her baptismal name, her formal name, was Janet, after Andrew's wife of his youth and his little daughter who died, who were both Janet. And in fact, Janet Hamilton also died. She was born in August 1864 here in Bendigo and died in June 1866. And her mother was bereft. She said in a letter to her own mother, "Never can I, with my mother's pride, bring you my own little darling Jessie and show you." And that's all I've got for you tonight. Just a taster of some of the delights ahead as I investigate the Brown family and their connection to Bendigo and how their religious worldview helped them to make sense of what was happening to them, including some of the exciting stuff. Thank you.
Any questions?
Yes,
Yes, up the back.
I do hope they managed to have a surviving child.
Ah, yes.
Yes, John, the firstborn, and Jane, the third daughter, both survived and had descendants, two of whom kept the letters, which means that we could read them.
Just thank you very much for that. That was great. I'm just thinking about, you said, how using the letters to understand how they navigated the goldfields. Are you going to look at how they navigated like bigger issues as well, like social issues or political issues did that come up in the letters at all?
Only big religious issues. So they were very committed, and there's a lot of tumult happening in the Presbyterian Church in this period. So yes, there is political controversy, but not maybe of this form that you might expect. The American Revolution gets a little byline and other major events, but not of the same interest as religious discussions. Yeah, it was a period of absolute tumult in the Presbyterian Church, the 19th century divisions and reunifications. It was all happening.
I can see why you called it Providence and Misfortune, because in the letters the word Providence comes up. I reckon it came up half a dozen times in that talk, and it's sort of used to explain what's happening. But do you think it's also used to make excuses sometimes?
Well, Providence does have a remarkable coincidence in that it aligns with what we think. It's handy in that way, isn't it? I mean, I prefer a God who is looking after me, and I think that that's how they saw their faith as directing their paths. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and it explained things that were unexplainable, or that they preferred not to look at the structural, political side of things that positioned them in that place at that time for those mishaps.
Can I ask a question? You had that quote from Maggie about the sort of failings of the Methodists, right? I get the feeling that if Maggie had stayed a bit longer like Jane, she might have come to grow to like the Methodists, because I think that Jane gets a lot of community from going to Methodist services and pleasant Sunday afternoons and things like that. So maybe the colonies sort of soften that sort of Presbyterianism.
I think the difference that you're pointing out there, Charles, is that the Presbyterian preachers were highly educated. So her brother becomes a doctor of philosophy in the 1870s. They're all university educated, but the Methodist local preachers were the people in the pews, and it was a voluntary structure that was based on lay effort. The Methodists, so you're less likely to get an educated, maybe an educated person, but maybe not a theologically educated person preaching is the difference. But Jane's more accepting because she's involved in the community support, cooking for each other's fundraisers and Sunday school anniversaries.
And she sets up a school, doesn't she?
Yes, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
There's a comment from the chat on Zoom. We've got 40 people watching on Zoom, by the way. That's from Yvonne. Her great-grandfather married his deceased wife's sister in Castlemaine in the early 1900s. So obviously by then that issue had been theologically resolved.
It depends which religious community you were from. The Scots, the Presbyterians held out longer, and were the ones who were involved in the debate here in Victoria more ardently than other denominations. And they had reasoning for that. They felt that they had fostered happy family lives by adhering to those ideas, and why would you change something that was working? There's also arguments about how the younger sisters would be vulnerable to the advances of men when they were, helpless in these households caring for young children, and wouldn't necessarily, they'd have to make a lot of fuss to make sure they're okay in that setting, especially when the brother-in-law was considered to be their brother.
Can I ask another question?
There's one from the audience.
Okay.
Thank you. That was really interesting and helpful. Question with the marriage and the marrying in-laws, were there also possibly property considerations as well? So, are they thinking about preventing property being inherited or accessed?
Well, those sorts of, when it's a remarriage, the man already has family obligations. So I don't think it would be, because it's his deceased wife's sister, so it's still in the family as such. But when the remarrying man is marrying someone out, then that is more of a consideration for the established circle. Who is he marrying? will she care for the children? And there's been more scholarship, of course, on stepmothers and the fate of the children of a widower, who, especially one who marries quickly.
Are there memorials on the graves, and if so, what nature are the memorials?
There was going to be a memorial on Maggie's grave. Jane was organising it, but she was out of sorts with Maggie's husband, James, at the time, and was going to write all about her own father in Scotland, and Maggie being the daughter of the Reverend, and ignore James altogether because he wasn't making the family happy at the time. He'd remarried quite quickly and moved to New Zealand to escape the bankruptcy of his mining business. So leaving Andrew Hamilton holding the baby as such, because all the bills and debts were coming in, and he skidded off to New Zealand with his new wife.
He came back.
He did come back, yes, to die from lung disease. So it was not a happy. Poor man. I mean, he remarried. His new wife had a baby, and she died in childbirth, leaving him with 2 young children and an infant. And caring for a newborn in those days without the mother was quite a feat. But her mother stepped up and fed the baby with the bottle, and she lived until she was 21, which was not too bad in those days.
Can I ask a final question? Do you think that their Presbyterianism was ever challenged by the fact that they'd entered into such a dangerous occupation in terms of both health, but more in terms of, looking for that will-o'-the-wisp load that would take them home?
Yes, it's actually really interesting because Presbyterians mostly, or Methodists more so, but Presbyterians, dissenters, were usually against gambling, and yet gold mining is a real game of risk and luck. So true, it's really pushing the envelope of what's acceptable. But God's providence in their worldview could deliver either good or not so good, and they had to take both with as their medicine. So if it was the bad outcomes, not striking it rich, then there was spiritual wealth to be earned and learned, and that's what they focused on. But yeah, it did test that understanding of what was luck and what was providence, and it was really around their attitude to the money if it came in. So how to be a rich Christian was a difficult task, and many rich entrepreneurs of industry and, not so much mining here. There were a few characters who worried about whether they were being giving away enough of their wealth or being good enough custodians of the God-given bounty that they found. But yes, that was a problem for some rich Christian, is how to behave so that you're giving enough away and not flaunting your status, but also using what you have in a constructive way, not just self-improvement, looking after your garden when you retire, but philanthropy of the generous nature.
I suppose the unfortunate thing is that the mine becomes payable about 20 years after they've left, doesn't it?
Yes, that's part of the tragedy of the Brown family story, is that they sold their mining rights, and that's when the new owners found all the gold, is after they'd returned, and they didn't have a stake in it anymore when the news came in.
That's not good property.
Yes, plenty of gold in this land, but not enough for them.
Thank you.